Okay, welcome to another episode. And today I have with me Dr. Willoughby. Darryn, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for agreeing to do this short interview on creatine. And before we start, could you give us a short introduction about yourself?
Yes, I'm a associate professor at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, here in the USA, and um, my PhD is in exercise physiology, specializing in neuromuscular physiology, and have a couple of supporting minors in nutritional biochemistry and molecular biology. Um, my research deals primarily with the biochemical and molecular mechanisms that regulate muscle hypertrophy and also muscle atrophy. So, in my lab, we do a lot of work with resistance exercise or resistance training, and in some cases, nutritional intervention, and that might mean various types of nutritional supplements and trying to determine effectiveness and efficacy of different types of training or nutritional programs on regulating some of the molecular pathways in muscle that are responsible for hypertrophy, increasing muscle mass. We've also done a number of studies looking at um, issues relative to perhaps muscle disuse or unloading, also exercise induced muscle damage, and looking at effects on oxidative stress and inflammation and some of the subsequent molecular signaling pathways that are involved in perhaps regulating muscle atrophy.
Interesting. And I also understand that you're a competitive bodybuilder yourself.
Yes, I'm a competitive bodybuilder. This past October, I competed and won and received my professional card in the global bodybuilding organization. It's not the IFBB. It's a newer organization that's quick and upcoming, growing. So it's not been around long enough to garner the same type of reputation as the IFBB. It's quickly gaining ground. And the nice thing about it, however, is that um, now, at least when I compete, I don't have to compete for trophies anymore. At least I can compete, for cash and prizes, and that's kind of nice. But I do that, and I enjoy it. It's probably more of a hobby than anything else. I'm 52 years old, so you know, it's still nice to know that at my age, I'm still able to train at the level and the intensity that I do, and I'm still able to compete. And um, so, the nice thing about when I won my pro card, I was being the age I was, I was competing against primarily guys that are way a lot younger than I was. So that always makes an old guy kind of feel good. So
Excellent. Congratulations on your pro card. And
thank you.
how long have you been competing?
Well, um, I've been actually training consistently for about 30 years, but early in my training process, I competed pretty routinely over the course of about 6 or 7 years back in the mid to late 80s, um, and um, and then I decided to go to graduate school. And so when I did, I took a layoff from competing. I didn't take a layoff from training. I just quit competing for a number of years, about 15, 16 years. I was in grad school, getting my master's, getting my PhD, and then going out and trying to set up and develop my career. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I kind of got the itch again to start competing. And so I started competing again, I guess, in 2009. So I've competed several times since then. Of course, my most recent one was when I won my pro card, and that was this past October. So, I mean, I've entered about a dozen shows or so, but again, there were half a dozen, or actually a bit more than, I guess, way back then, and then several as of the last 5 years with that long break in between. So, but like I said, I took a pretty long layoff from competing, but not from training. I continued to train and grind every day. So
Impressive to have been working out for 30 years consistently.
yeah, it's been good. Sometimes it takes its toll on an old body, but I'd hate to think where I would be if I hadn't continued to train. So yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Okay, let's dive into the questions, and the topic for today is creatine. So could we just start by could you start by explaining what creatine is?
Yeah, creatine is an amino acid derivative. It's called a guanidino compound that that in the body can be synthesized endogenously, you know, and in relatively small amounts. And so, and when, from glycine, arginine, and methionine. And so, for the most part, however, as I said, that happens in the body. But, most of us find ourselves, at least those that, in athletics and exercise and such, we find ourselves using this, this compound exogenously so that we supplement our diet with it. Because, the extent in which it's been suggested, the extent in which our body makes this compound endogenously doesn't seem to be enough to be what would be considered ergogenic, if you will, compared to what we're able to increase the intramuscular levels of creatine to, at least in someone who is what we would consider a responder. So, but anyway, creatine is used in the muscle. It's going to be phosphorylated with an enzyme called creatine kinase, and then to form creatine phosphate. And then that creatine phosphate is going to be used to recycle, if you will, ATP, because once muscles start contracting with very high intense muscle contractions, then the muscle begins to use up ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, very, very, very quickly. And then that leaves a very high to what we call ADP to ATP ratio in the cell. And then at that point, then creatine phosphate will be dephosphorylated, and that phosphated group removed from creatine, and then attached to ADP and used to recycle, if you will, resynthesize ATP for further energy utilization and muscle contraction. So that would be the general scenario of what creatine is and what the significance of it is within our muscle cells.
Okay, so basically what it does is it donates phosphate by the use of creatine kinase to regenerate ATP from ADP.
Correct.
Yeah. So how much creatine can we produce or synthesize on our own during a day?
Most research has suggested that anywhere from about 2 to 3 grams a day it's been suggested that seems to be the relatively typical amount, but that's in someone of kind of what we would consider a typical body mass, and we usually consider that to be in a 70 kilogram male. And somebody who's much larger, like an athlete, bodybuilder, has very, very high muscle mass, lean mass, then it could perhaps be even based on his need to be able to substantiate that additional muscle mass with creatine. So interestingly enough, though, at least I haven't seen any data to support that implication. But I would suspect that again, what I've seen is that roughly 2 grams or so, but in somebody much larger, it certainly could be more than that. How much is hard to say, but at least that's what I'm familiar with.
Okay. Are there any dietary sources that can provide us with creatine?
Yeah, our Dietary sources, I mean, what we normally get is from meat sources, particularly red meat, but, meat sources are going to be dietarily, uh, how's a better way to put this? Meat sources are, particularly compared to vegetable sources, but your meat sources are going to be what is going to provide us with, with creatine from actual food sources. But still, that being said, the amount of creatine within something like red meat is relatively low, and so I've seen suggestions that to be able to to be able to eat enough red meat to be able to provide the same amount of creatine than we could get if we were supplementing with creatine would be several pounds. So most people don't just sit down and eat pounds of red meat at a time. So that would be where creatine supplementation via something like a powdered creatine monohydrate, for instance, or other creatine derivatives could be beneficial in being able to try to augment the amount of creatine one is able to ingest in their diet.
Okay. You also mentioned something about responder, and because we usually talk about people being responders and non-responders
Right.
when they supplement with creatine.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that when we talk about creatine supplementation, some people respond quite well to supplementation with creatine, particularly relative to being able to increase their amount of muscle creatine levels once they begin supplementing. Some people don't respond very well, and we label those individuals non-responders. Um, it's been a big question mark as to why that is, why some people respond, why some people don't respond. So we have responders versus non-responders, and we don't really seem to know exactly why that is. And so, there's been suggestions that it could be due to um, the fact that there's some type of limitation in a non-responder. There could be some type of a limitation relative to the creatine transporter in the the sarcolemma or the cell membrane in muscle, in which creatine is taken up in the muscle through. Um, it's also been suggested that there could be a limiting factor relative to simply the ability in an individual relative to their creatine kinase enzyme's ability to actually phosphorylate a certain amount of creatine once it's taken up into the cell. Because generally, uh, in a more typical scenario, usually about anywhere between 60 to 70% of creatine that's taken up in the muscle is going to be phosphorylated. So we'll have, say, 60 to 70% that's creatine phosphate, and the remainder will be unphosphorylated. So typically we would consider total muscle creatine to be creatine phosphate and that free creatine that's not phosphorylated. So, again, we don't really know for sure what the issue is relative to differentiating between somebody being a responder and a non-responder. But typically, and then I've also seen, based on the number of studies we've done with creatine, I've actually kind of thrown in a different term in there, what we call a pseudo responder, because we can see people who respond very robustly and people who don't, and then people who respond moderately in between the so-called responder and the non-responder. So I've labeled those people pseudo responders, but nevertheless, we still really don't know for sure why some people respond and why some people don't respond to creatine supplementation.
Okay. I've seen some studies that vegetarians seems to respond very well when they supplement with creatine.
Yeah, I've seen some of those studies as well. That 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 have suggested that as well, and it's likely due to the fact that individuals who are vegetarians, are not going to find themselves, aside from what their body makes endogenously, the amount of creatine that our bodies make endogenously, they're not going to be confronted with large amounts of creatine in their diet on a daily basis anyway, since they don't eat meat. Particularly if we're talking about vegans, if they don't eat meat, then again, their bodies are going to not see, quote unquote, see or experience, fairly large increases or amounts of creatine in their diet on a daily basis. So that being said, I've also seen some suggestions that vegetarians, their creatine transporter could be somewhat hypersensitive to creatine, and so when the muscle in the creatine transporter is confronted with larger amounts of creatine, then it's going to, because it could hypersensitive, could actually be taking up creatine at a much more accelerated rate than it would otherwise be.
Interesting. Okay, next question is what advantages is it to supplementing with creatine in regards to performance?
Well, assuming somebody's a responder, if they don't respond, then there's probably no advantage. But assuming somebody, is a responder, even, somewhat a pseudo responder to a robust responder, then what happens is that those individuals are going to find themselves increasing the total amount of creatine within their muscle. And so that being said, as opposed to no supplementation at all. So what that does is that it creates a potential greater energy depot for resynthesizing ATP than it would otherwise be. So what ends up going to happen is that those individuals will likely find themselves increasing their anaerobic endurance. So, they can find themselves perhaps increasing their muscle strength, perhaps increasing their power output. In some cases, I've seen where strength gains haven't been affected dramatically. Power output has been. I've seen data to suggest that power output and strength hasn't been affected dramatically, but overall anaerobic endurance has been. For instance, duration in which those individuals can sustain a particular exercise event. Let's say, for instance, in resistance training, could be total repetitions on a particular exercise, bench press, squats, leg press, shoulder press. So, before it, let's say at a particular load, at a particular weight that individual is typically lifts, if they can do, for instance, 8 reps, then with creatine, for instance, and them being able to increase their anaerobic endurance, now they may be able to do 11 reps. And so if that's the case, and that carries over into the rest of the workout, then what happens is that person is able to increase their overall volume of training in a given workout. And by increasing volume and repetition, by increasing repetitions and volume, and then the so-called time under tension that many times people will talk about relative to the amount of time the muscle stays under tension, then that can generate positive effects on signaling pathways in muscle that are going to be responsible for upregulating muscle protein synthesis, and over the course of time with training, muscle hypertrophy, and so on and so forth.
So do we see more advantages by supplementing with creatine in exercises that you use resistance, like powerlifting, bodybuilding, weightlifting, compared to endurance activities?
Yeah, you're going to see creatine is going to be much more active in what we would consider more of a short-term, higher intensity, more anaerobic type of event. This could be something like obviously powerlifting, weightlifting. It could be something that's more power output generated relative to something maybe, obviously like vertical jumping. It could be something like sprinting. Something like in high jumping and long jumping. Various types of power-oriented events in track and field. Sometimes the issue, however, comes with, for instance, like sprinting and those types of track and field events is that if in fact with creatine supplementation, if a person experiences increases in body mass, because sometimes it's been suggested that people, it may cause them to increase total body water, because creatine sometimes can be associated with cell volumizing because of increased uptake into muscle. So if a person, increases their total body mass by, 2 or 3 kilograms, perhaps then and they're running a 100-meter dash, then obviously that might detrimentally affect their time, even in the presence of beneficial effects of creatine, because now they're having to, obviously move a heavier body mass. So, I've seen pros and cons about using supplementation in, for instance, events like sprinting and such, where they're having to really overcome their body mass to succeed in an event. But nevertheless, however, because it is so highly anaerobic, then creatine definitely can have an effect. Relative to endurance exercise, there's really not any, chances are there's really not going to be much benefit at all supplementing creatine with aerobic type events. Now, I've seen some studies that they've done that based on the fact that in muscle we have what we call a creatine transporter mechanism, where creatine is associated with shuttling, if you will, ADP into the mitochondria. So when we're using aerobic metabolism, and the ADP in the mitochondria are used to regenerate ATP in conjunction with the electron transport system activity, then we can get an overall enhanced energy liberating effect that way. And that being said, it could be suggested that people's overall performance output could be improved with creatine supplementation based on that scenario. However, there's not but has been done using creatine supplementation with endurance training haven't really shown any positive effects. So it's very unlikely that creatine supplementation would have any type of robust ergogenic effect on aerobic performance.
Okay, excellent. So what we safely can say is that there's a lot of research that has proven that creatine works, assuming you're a responsive person, and especially if you're exercising with some sort of resistance. But are there any research in regards to creatine supplementation and general health, like for example diseases or other stuff like that?
Actually, there are, and interestingly enough, is that creatine started out. So it seems creatine started out, being used as a potential ergogenic aid, relative to exercise in, for instance, healthy or apparently healthy younger populations. But then, it started being utilized in older populations as well, thinking, well, okay, if it can perhaps, improve muscle performance, particularly, in based on some of the longer term training studies, because there are a number of studies out there which have given, creatine over, 8, 9, 10, 12 weeks of resistance training, for instance, and look to see if it improves strength and increases in body and lean body mass, and so on and so forth. But because of the all the work that was done in apparently healthy younger populations, then a good amount of work started to occur in older populations as well, looking at creatine's ability to help, for instance, attenuate sarcopenia, muscle mass losses associated with age and physical inactivity, and then looking to use that as a counter, perhaps a nutritional based countermeasure for sarcopenia, and and then also in conjunction with exercise to try to see can we use this approach to try to improve not only muscle performance but overall health and well-being, knowing that as an individual start to lose muscle mass, then their quality of life begins to degrade appreciably as a result of that. And then there's a number of other studies that have come out that are more kind of clinical and medical in nature, and that's the interesting thing with creatine, as I was trying to point out earlier. Got sidetracked a little bit, but is this is a supplement that was started out being used primarily in an exercise scenario, but now, even though it continues to do that, now it's starting to being used in more of a clinical medical scenario where it's being looked to treat, say, neurological or cognitive disorders. There's a number of studies because of the fact that cerebral neurons in the brain also utilize creatine as well, and so there's a number of studies that have shown that supplementing with creatine has been effective in improving memory deficits and improving cognitive function, cognitive ability and thought processing and such. And while this is primarily in older individuals, it does help perhaps substantiate to some extent the role of creatine in being able to have a positive effect in these individuals as well. I've seen some work with creatine supplementation in trying to help improve dementia. These situations of early onset or pre Alzheimer's. There are a number of other scenarios as well. ALS is another one that where creatine has been used to try to have a positive impact in the more clinical medical scenario. So it at least at this point, creatine goes way beyond simply just the exercise arena. Now it's being utilized way beyond that, and even the medical arena as well.
Okay, excellent. So there seems to be a lot of different creatine supplements on the market. What is the best form of creatine that you can use?
Well, there's this continues to still be a hot topic, really. I mean, because, but regardless of all these different versions of creatine, whether it be creatine, ethyl ester, creatine pyruvate, creatine citrate, creatine hydrochloride, and creatine pyruvate, and the list seems to go on and on. A lot of those different products don't have a lot of research behind them substantiating the claims that those types of creatine are much more effective than creatine monohydrate. And even the few studies that are available on some of those different creatine variations, they do not show that they are superior to creatine monohydrate. Until more research is done, until we have the data to suggest otherwise, it is my belief, and the belief of a large number of my colleagues in this field, that at this point in time, creatine monohydrate is the best way to go. None of these other creatine versions have yet been shown. The ones that have been subjected to research, none of them yet have shown to be superior than creatine monohydrate.
I think I remember that creatine ethyl ester actually showed that it converted to a lot more creatinine compared to monohydrate in
That's
research.
correct. That's correct.
And they also did a comparison with pH buffered creatine compared to creatine monohydrate and didn't see a superior
That's
effect of
correct.
using.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so creatine monohydrate is the way to go then.
Yeah, at this point in time, again, unless something comes up to prove otherwise, then yes, yeah, that is correct.
Okay, excellent. What about people talk about dosage, if you only can use a maintenance dose, or if you should load, and if there's a time where it's more beneficial to take creatine supplementation? What's your take on that?
Well, in terms of, and again, assuming someone is a responder, if somebody is going to be just training on a daily basis, all right, let's say resistance training, they're going to, they train every day. And so, and it's something they're going to continue to do over the course of, several months, for instance, or even longer than that. Then they're going to start taking creatine. Then in that particular case, I mean, there's really no reason why they should load. Because, even at a so-called 5 to 7 grams per day of a maintenance, typical maintenance, that's the typical maintenance dose, if you will, that, over the course of, say, several days, I mean, certainly within a week's time, they're going to be able to, for the most part, fully saturate their muscle with creatine, so that they can begin to enjoy any benefits from the creatine that they expect to gain. So they don't need the so-called loading dose. Now, if somebody, for instance, is, I don't know, if they're it's a good example here. If somebody is going to be getting ready for, say, for a powerlifting or a weightlifting competition, and it's, for instance, 2 weeks away, and they want to start taking creatine to give themselves perhaps a beneficial edge at the competition. Again, but they only have about 2 weeks. Then in that particular case, then it would probably be wise for them to load for 5 or 6 days. Load up and and make sure to quickly saturate the muscle with creatine, and then and then drop that down to either a maintenance dose right up to the competition. That way they can have more assurance that by the time their competition rolls around, they're going to have pretty much a full saturated state in muscle of creatine, so that it can have a chance in improving their performance. Again, that's assuming that they're a responder. That's the total caveat on all of this. So again, for something that's very, very short term, then loading can be beneficial. Let me say, loading might be more beneficial. If it's not something that is more acute and short term, but somebody's just training for a long term, then they don't really need to load at all. Just start out with their typical maintenance dose, and just keep that day in and day out, and they should gain all the benefits they need in a relatively short period of time.
And it doesn't matter when you take this maintenance dose?
Oh yeah, in regards to that, I've seen some studies that they've given, and I hear suggestions about taking creatine, like right before exercise, but I'm not convinced that, because of the because of the time point of uptake and delivery, which is relatively quick. But um, I'm not totally convinced that taking it only pre-exercise is the way to go. The issue here is that based on how long a person is going to be supplementing with creatine, the main concern here is to make sure that to take the supplement on a consistent daily basis so that they can saturate the muscle with creatine and keep it saturated. So that means that it really doesn't matter at what point in time it's taken during the day, just as long as it's taken on a consistent basis. If somebody prefers to take it every day right before they exercise, then fine. If not, then they may instead choose to take it earlier in the day. They may want to take it in the morning as they wake up, assuming that that is their morning. I mean, if somebody has a job where they work all night long, then it may be a different scenario. But anyway, I think you see my point is that the time of the day. I haven't seen any data. That is that strongly suggests that creatine should be taken. It's at any point in time versus, say, right before a workout or right after a workout or whatever the case may be. So, again, the issue is that it's taken consistently on a daily basis so that those individuals can improve the chance of maintaining an increased level of total muscle creatine content so that it's there to help them for the muscular activity that they want it for.
Okay. And long-term safety of using creatine, is this something you should use all the time, or should you use it a couple of months and then go off the creatine?
That's a good question too, and I know at one point there was a thought that creatine should be cycled. For instance, you get on it for 4 to 6 weeks, and then you come off of it to 4 to 6 weeks because you get on and you increase your muscle levels of creatine, and then over the course of time, if you stay on it, then you down-regulate or desensitize the creatine transporter, and then, for instance, that individual begins to lose the ability to maintain a larger amount of muscle creatine. That was kind of the suggestion. And there was some earlier animal data in rodents that suggested that might be a possible scenario, but the data wasn't straightforward. It was the data just suggested that there might be some down regulation of the creatine transporter. But that being said, since then, and there have been other studies that have come out where they've actually done more longer term supplementation with creatine, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case either. So I've seen and I've read and I've heard some academics in the field that have suggested that you can just take a daily maintenance dose of creatine for as long as you want, and it's not something that you need to come off of or cycle off of, if you will. So again, I don't necessarily think it's a situation where creatine would have to be cycled, if you will. Is it something that someone could or should want to stay on all of the time? I mean, just day in, day out for long periods of time? I'm not real sure. Probably not. In terms if there's a safety issue with that, that's likely not the case either. I mean, you're talking about creatine monohydrate. This is a compound that our bodies make, that our bodies synthesize on its own. You know, I've seen suggestions to say that, you know, creatine is going to be, you know, chronic exposures to creatine is going to, you know, cause renal damage and you know, hepatic damage, you know, kidney and liver damage. And of course, you know, I'm not convinced of that at all. And there's been a few longer term creatine supplementation studies, like a year or so, that, of course, you know, a year is not 5 years, but, you know, certainly a year is much better than, say, 6 weeks. But that, you know, that showed no negative adverse effects of being on creatine daily for a year or so. So anyway, so like I said, I you know, I personally, based on my experience with creatine and what I've seen in the literature, I'm not convinced that there's really any reason to be alarmed relative to creatine having any type of negative impact. So,
okay, excellent. So if we take the typical maintenance dose that a lot of people use, for instance, 5 grams, how much of that is actually absorbed by the body?
You know, that would be hard to put an exact number on, but I'm just going to say, I'm going to say most of it. And the reason I say that is, we have a study that we just recently submitted to a journal. It's not published yet, but it's in press, where we gave, for 5 weeks, while subjects were doing resistance training, we had them take a maintenance dose. We gave them a maintenance dose, about 7 grams or so a day for 5 weeks, and had them load up for the first 5 days. So they loaded for 5 days, and then they dropped to a maintenance dose of approximately 7 grams per day. And the loading dose was about 20 grams per day. And then we had them drop to a maintenance dose for the remaining 4 weeks, plus a couple of days. And what we saw after, and we took at baseline, and after the 5th day of loading, we took urine samples, we took blood samples, and we took muscle biopsy. We took muscle samples. And so after that 5th day, what we found was that the levels of muscle creatine had increased dramatically. And, you know, they were still had high levels of creatine in blood, in circulation. And in urine, the levels of creatinine in the urine was just dramatic, extremely elevated. So what that implied is that, you know, after 5 days with the loading dose, these people were urinating out large amounts of the creatine that they had been ingesting. The interesting thing is that we did the same thing about halfway through the remaining 4 weeks, at the end of the 5th week, and then we had them wash out for an additional 4 weeks where they didn't take any creatine at all. So at the halfway point, and after the 5th week of supplementation, only at a maintenance dose, their muscle creatine levels were still maintained. They really weren't much different than what they were after the 5 days of loading. They were still urinating out large amounts of creatinine, and so almost as much as what they were not quite, but almost as much as what they were urinating out after the 5 days of loading with 20 grams. And then after the 4-week washout, their levels were back down to almost identical to what it was at baseline. So I'm setting this scenario up because, even though it's hard to say what that actual number or percent is, I will say this, is that even, over the course of, say, 4 weeks, after 5 days of loading, and then the remaining, say, almost 4 weeks of a maintenance dose, while those individuals were maintaining their muscle creatine levels, they were urinating out large amounts of creatine. So what that suggests is that those individuals, the dose that they were being given on a daily basis was more than enough to maintain muscle creatine levels, but yet it was it was in excess also of what their body was able to absorb because of the large amount of creatinine that they were urinating out. So to answer your question, that being said, I would say based on 5 to 7 grams that one would take in, I would say that the body assimilates most of it.
Is there something you can do to better the absorption? Because some people seem to struggle with upset stomach from taking creatine monohydrate. So is there a difference if you take it with cold water compared to warm water, for example?
Well, that's interesting because that's one of the primary reasons I don't take it, because it does upset my stomach. And so, I've tried taking it, mixing it with warm water, cold water. For me, it doesn't really help. So I don't really take creatine myself. I really don't take creatine, and it's not because I wouldn't, because I think that I could get some benefit from it, but the gastric distress that I get from it is just, it's not worth it. So some people feel that warm water will help solubilize the creatine better than in cold water. Whether or not that's exactly true or not sure. I would just say that if people find themselves struggling with gastric upset with creatine, then try it with either warm water or cold water and see if it makes a difference. If one does make a noticeable difference, then that's the one you want to stay with. If neither one of them works, then there may be other alternatives that somebody could try. I know that there's some of the you can get some of these chewable creatine tablets that they kind of have like a lemon lime citrus taste to them. I've tried those before, and I've seen like even though it's still you chew them up and it's still kind of in a creatine monohydrate. But I tried those before, and it's helped a bit. For instance, I've been able to tolerate it a bit. I've taken before encapsulated creatine, but again, once the capsule's dissolved away, you still got the powder in your stomach. So there's really no difference there. So, and I know some of these other versions of creatine, particularly in trying to buffer creatine, thinking that that might help as well. I've heard of people baking soda to try to help buffer the stomach acid a bit so that they could tolerate creatine better. So I'm not sure that that's overly effective as well, but anyway, so that's probably the best I can do on that answer, is that there's just no I've heard of people trying different routes to try to get around this issue.
Yeah.
So that's what I would suggest, is just is just try to experiment and try to find something that might work for someone. What works for one person may not work for the other. As I said, in my case, nothing seems to really work. So I'd like to be able to take creatine, but like I said, I personally just my my digestion and my physiology just doesn't seem to tolerate it very well.
Yeah, yeah, I'm the same way. I like if I dump 5 gram dose of creatine monohydrate in my protein shake and drink it, I have problems right away. But I try to experiment a bit with it. So I noticed that if I take only 3 grams and put it in hot liquid, for example tea, and use enough water, like I use 1 deciliter of water for each gram of creatine, and stir it around and make it dilute itself in the liquid, I don't seem to get the same problems. So that's the way I figured out that a way to use creatine without having the side effects.
Well, that's and that makes sense to try to dilute the concentration out a bit. And I have a friend that I train with some. He's kind of similar to me, very similar to you. And what he'll do is he'll split his dose up into several doses throughout the day. He can't tolerate, say, a full creatine dose at a time, so he'll just take 1 or 2 grams at a time over like 4 or 5 times throughout the day, and that seems to work better for him. And so, but it's something that he just kind of, like you, he experimented with, and he found something that seemed to work for him, and so that's what he does.
Yeah. I know that they also used to do that in some of the earlier studies that came out on creatine. They used to use hot tea to dilute the creatine, hot liquid.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, final question. In regards to creatine and activation of satellite cells, could you briefly explain what satellite cells are and how creatine affects them?
Satellite cells are what we call muscle stem cells. These are undifferentiated myoblasts, or these are, for instance, these are muscle cells that never actually grew up. That's kind of the way I use it to explain it to my students. So when we're conceived and as we grow from an infant to an adult, most of our cells will grow and mature with the rest of the body, and satellite cells don't do that. They stay in this immature state, and they never grow and they never mature. They're located beneath the sarcolemma between the basement membrane, or the basal lamina, and skeletal muscle, and they just sit there. They just sit there quiet and what we call quiescent. They're just, and when we say they're undifferentiated, that means that they never proliferated into actual full mature muscle cells. And so we know that there are ways in which we can activate satellite cells. Muscle damage is one, because satellite cells are involved in recovery and rejuvenation, and that process in which muscle is involved in response to a damage. We know that muscle contraction, particularly kind of higher force contraction, say with resistance training, will also stimulate satellite cells. We also know that now that there are some nutritional interventions that also can play a role in activating satellite cells. There was a study done several years ago, I believe in 2007, with Olson's group. Just a simply elegant study, where they, over the course of say 16 weeks, they had people do resistance training, either with no training, or there was just training, a group that did training with protein, whey protein or a group that did training with creatine, creatine monohydrate supplementation, and they showed that the group that received the creatine had a greater increase in satellite cell activity, the number of satellite cells that were activated. And this is important, and it also, in the end, that group, they underwent greater increases in indicators of muscle hypertrophy and in muscle strength. And the way that satellite cells work once that they're activated is they go through a process of differentiation and the proliferation, and then they will form something called a myotube that contains, even though these myotubes they have no contractile properties at all, so they don't contract like an actual muscle. They're multinucleated like a mature muscle fiber. So these myotubes end up instead donating their nuclei to pre-existing mature fibers, and so now these muscle fibers have more nuclei, and having more nuclei means more DNA, and having more DNA means having a greater number of muscle-specific genes that, when expressed, can play a role in increasing muscle protein synthesis. So over the course of time with training, this obviously means potentially greater impetus for muscle hypertrophy and performance improvements as well. Now, based on how creatine plays a role in this, and I know we did a study with creatine supplementation in response to training as well, and this was before the Olson study. And our study was done kind of in response to a study, I think, that was published in 2004 out of Peter Hespel's lab, where they gave creatine supplementation over the course of time. And their study and our study showed that it increased the content of myogenic regulatory factors in muscle that are known to play a role in activating satellite cells. And these myogenic regulatory factors, MyoD, myogenin, MRF4, MYF5. Hespel's study, my study, showed a greater effect on the MRF4 myogenic regulatory factor, and that regulatory factor, we know, has a critical role in activating satellite cells, based on its role as a regulation factor, and also as a transcription factor as well in upregulating gene expression. Now, the Olson study, they didn't do anything with any of those markers, but they were looking at the numbers of satellite cells per muscle fiber, and a number of other more direct measures of satellite cell activation. And so, to answer your question, I mean, how does creatine activate satellite cells? We don't know for sure, but with some studies, one of my studies, the Olson study, some other studies that have been published, there is a good amount of data to suggest that creatine does play a role in this, and it could be due to the fact, and it's been suggested, that creatine may work in cooperation with these myogenic regulatory factors, particularly MRF4, into helping to synergize or augment the activity of these myogenic regulatory factors as they are signaling these satellite cells to become activated. So we don't know for sure, but we have some thoughts and some suggestions as to why creatine seems to have a role in doing that. So we'll just continue to have to play the waiting game to be able to find out exactly how that occurs.
Okay. I think we covered the most relevant questions on creatine supplementation. I want to thank you so much for doing this interview, Darryn. If people want to read more about you and your publications, where can they find that information?
I would say probably the best place to look would be to go on to Medline or PubMed, which is just PubMed, PubMed, PubMed.com. Once you get in there, then to type in the search box, just type my last name, and then followed by the letters D and then S, and so it would be Willoughby DS, and then all of the studies that I have published that are indexed by PubMed, there's, I don't know, 30 or 35 of those will pop up, and and so individuals can can go in and look and see the different types of studies that we've done. Like I said, we've done a number of studies with creatine supplementation. Most of the studies deal with resistance exercise, resistance training, some type of nutritional interventions. Some of those involve nutritional supplementations, whey protein, amino acids, leucine, citrulline, and then on and on. So that would be the best place to go. If they have any questions, for instance, about anything specifically, they can just send me an email. Here at Baylor, they can just go online and just type in my name and then Baylor University, and then my information will come up, and they'll be able to find my email address on there right away. Or they can type my name in and search for me on Facebook. I have a actual more business related page on Facebook where I fairly often I'll post on there about the studies that we're doing and studies that we've had coming out, or post information on there about exercise, sport nutrition, resistance training, and so on and so forth. So as I said, it's more of an educational based page. So they can search for me there and request more for me there, or follow me on there as well.
Okay, excellent. Once again, Darryn, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview, and have a nice day.
Thank you very much. It was I enjoyed doing it. It was an honor and a pleasure. And you, if there's any help out in way, then don't hesitate to contact me.
I will definitely do that again. I know that we have a lot of other topics we can also discuss with you. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, my friend. You take good care.
You too. Bye bye.
All right. Bye.